Greetings from St. Meinrad Archabbey in southern Indiana. My name is Father Eugene Hensell, and for many years past I've always come to Nassau during Lent, and we would gather around 12 o'clock or so at Sacred Heart Parish, and I'd talk about the Bible. And over the years, this sort of continued to grow until last year when we ran into this strange pandemic and we had to cancel. And since last March, we have been here mostly under pretty tight lockdown. So once again, I couldn't make it to Nassau. To show you the contrast, if you were looking outside our window here, you would notice that there's snow on the ground and it's about 27 degrees. Where you are, it's not snowing, I know that, and it's certainly not close to 27. But Archbishop Pinder asked me if since I can't come personally, if I would maybe record the sessions, and then we can show them some way or other. He knows how to do that. And so I agreed to do that, so that's what we're going to do. The topic that I've picked for this year is encountering the human face of God. Reflections on the Gospel of Mark. Now, I picked that title on purpose because of all the Gospels, all four of them, Mark is the one that is most radically committed to showing you the human face of Jesus. Now, he certainly believes that Jesus was divine, but he believes that the way you get to that divinity, the way you get to understand that divinity is by going in and through the humanity. You can't start with the divinity and just stay on that level. A lot of people find that a little disturbing because they are used to talking about Jesus, the divine person, Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Son of Man, and all of those things. But Mark, while he'll use those titles, he wants us to focus on Jesus, the human person, because that's where we get to see him in his role as the divine Savior. A few things about Mark we need to know before we start. Mark is the very first gospel written. That means, of course, that he has a certain priority. We also know that the other gospels, at least the synoptics, so-called Matthew, Mark, Luke synoptics, that Matthew and Luke used a lot of Mark's gospel. So Mark is very important for lots of reasons, but one reason is he established this sort of literary genre called a gospel. And so when Matthew and Luke write their story of Jesus, they follow very carefully the outline that you have in the Gospel of Mark. We also know that for a long, long time, not many people read Mark. Some of that is due to St. Augustine, who said that he thought Mark was really a terrible gospel. He thought it was a bad summary of Matthew and Luke. He thought it was written on about the level of a fourth grader. And so he said, I can't imagine why anybody would read Mark when you have this magnificent Gospel of Matthew. And so for centuries, nobody read Mark. Everybody read Matthew. Until about a little over 100 years ago, scholars started to rediscover this Gospel of Mark and to find in this gospel some very creative theology that sort of didn't get seen earlier on. Even though when you look at Mark, many people think that it's incomplete, that there's just things missing that ought to be there. For example, there are no infancy narratives in the Gospel of Mark, no story about how Jesus was born. There's no Sermon on the Mount, very important segment of Matthew's Gospel. in the Sermon on the Mount is where you find the Lord's Prayer. You don't find that in Mark at all. You don't find some of your favorite stories. Parable of the Good Samaritan, it's not there. Parable of the prodigal son, not there. Story of the Samaritan woman at the well, not there. So because of that, many people thought Mark was incomplete. And so they would go over to the other Gospels and sort of pick that one and pick this one and put it all together and make it whole. That's the wrong thing to do. Mark, as we have it now, is whole and complete. Meaning, this is the way the author wanted it to be. And so that's what we have to deal with. That it is not a deficient gospel. It is not missing some points that it should have. It's just the way this author wanted to tell you his story of Jesus. The Gospel of Mark was written pretty close to the year 70 of the Common Era. That date is very important, 70, because that is the date that the Jerusalem temple, famous Jerusalem temple, was destroyed by the Romans. That destruction was monumental for both Jews and Christians because in those early days, remember, Christians were still Jews. They attended the temple. The temple had a very important significance for them. But by the year 70, it was gone. Many scholars who read the Gospel of Mark say the Gospel of Mark was written either right before that destruction, and in a way is an attempt to prepare you for it, or it was written right after the destruction and is sort of a reflection on how monumental that was. They'll point especially to Mark chapter 13, which is a rather strange chapter, but it seems to be a chapter that people go to when they want to talk about the destruction of the temple and what all went on at that occurrence. So the temple, I'm thinking, the way I read the gospel, I think the temple has already been destroyed. And so Mark, in a sense, is about picking up the pieces. So the temple has been destroyed. Remember, one of the fundamental beliefs of the early Christian church was Jesus is going to come again soon. St. Paul thought it would happen in his own lifetime, but it didn't. St. Mark is convinced that the second coming is going to happen at some point. And so there's this anticipation. And if you think that Jesus is going to come pretty quickly, a lot of things can get put on hold. We don't have a lot of time, so we don't have to worry about this, this, and this because we won't be here. The second coming will happen. Well, by the time Mark wrote his gospel, and this is, Jesus died in the 30s. This gospel was written in 70. So you've had a lot of time there. Jesus has not come a second time, as expected. They don't really want to come to the conclusion that maybe he won't come, but this has put a certain wrench in everything. Why hasn't he come? When will he come? And what are we supposed to do in the meantime? How long can we wait? Well, that's a big issue. There's another problem. The thing has not developed as they thought. The Christian church has not developed as everybody thought it would. The way the plan was laid out was Christians would proclaim the gospel of Jesus to their fellow Jews. And as soon as the Jews heard the good news about Jesus, the understanding was they would just flock into the church. They would just be so eager to have more that we probably wouldn't have enough room. But that never happened. not many Jews actually did come into the church. And not only that, but the people who were coming into the church, the people who were attracted to the church, were not the ones that the Christians wanted in. Gentiles, Greeks, people without much of a Jewish background at all, and certainly not an Old Testament background. For some reason, they were finding the good news of Jesus Christ very enticing. And included in that group were, of all people, Samaritans. And you have to remember, Samaritans hated Jews and Jews hated Samaritans. So, this is not the way the grand plan was supposed to work. The church is also, in Mark's time, being harassed. It's being harassed from two segments. One is the Roman Empire. Depending on who the emperor was, you didn't know what was going to happen. The emperor and the empire as such were not very congenial to Christianity. They thought it was kind of a pagan religion, really, and they didn't care much for it. Periodically, there would be persecutions. You wouldn't know exactly why. You wouldn't be warned. It just all of a sudden the emperor decided that maybe it's time to put the Christians in their place, and there would be an outburst of persecution. Not only that, but the Jewish Christians in the synagogue were being told that their membership in the synagogue was being questioned. And the reason it was being questioned was not because, as you might think, not because the Jewish Christians claimed Jesus to be the Messiah. That was okay. There were many ideas about who the Messiah might be, and there had been people in the past claiming to be the Messiah. Never worked out. The attitude basically had come to be, well, if it's true, they'll win. If it's not true, they'll go like all the others went. And so far, everybody had gone. Nobody had really substantiated being the Messiah. But the Christians went further than just saying, we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They said, we believe Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Well, you see, it's that second part that got them in trouble, Son of God. Because that, according to the Jewish Christians in the synagogue, that violated the first commandment, which says you can only have one God. Yahweh is our God. And you cannot have any other God. You can't have any images of any other God. There's only one God, absolute monotheism, one God and one God only. If you believe that Yahweh is God, and then you believe Jesus is the Son of God, well, that's God. So you end up with two gods. You can't have that. That's not acceptable. And so the synagogue officials were saying, you have to give up that belief of Jesus being the Son of God if you're going to remain in good standing in the synagogue. Well, the Christians are not willing to give that up. So they're getting a lot of hassle, from the synagogue officials. And eventually, by the time of Matthew's gospel, the Christians have been kicked out of the synagogue. Matthew's absolutely outraged. Read his chapter 23, and you'll get an idea of just how angry Matthew is that the Jews have kicked the Christians out of the synagogue. Another thing that's happened now, those who joined the church and those who found that being a member of the church had a lot of joy to it and a lot of expectation and that sort of thing, now they were starting to experience suffering. They were being persecuted. They didn't sign up for suffering. Nobody told them, if you become a follower of Jesus, you better be prepared because as he went, so you will go. And we know how he went, by being crucified. Well, we heard that, but we were so happy and overjoyed at the good news that we never paid much attention to the suffering part, but now it's here. And we're not quite sure what we're going to do with it. It's caused a very deep fear amongst many of our people. And remember how the church was set up in those days. It was what was called house churches, small little congregations, small enough to meet in somebody's house. And the gospel here was written for those people. There might be several of those house churches. It wasn't just one big, huge congregation like we might be used to, but a bunch of small little house churches. And now people were starting to leave. There was some questions about why are they leaving? What's going to happen? How can you stay? Is it safe? What's going to be the future? All these things have been starting to float around now, and it's because of all of this that the author of Mark's Gospel has decided it's time to put this story down in a written form. Now, they've been teaching Christianity for a long time, since Jesus died, since, the early 30s. Christians have been teaching about the faith, but they didn't have much of it written down. They would have stories that would circulate in a variety of ways. If you were a Christian catechist, you might have a little sack of miracle stories that somebody gave you, and you would use those when you would teach people about Christianity. And then the person after you would take the same stories, and he might or she might teach in a little different way. Somebody else might have a sack full of parables. Now, they wouldn't know the background of any of that, so if somebody would say, well, when did Jesus say that? Well, I don't know. Well, what was going on that made him say it? I don't have any idea. All I got was my little sack here, and I know how I'm going to use them. I'm going to teach them, but I don't know. So you had a lot of that sort of looseness, but it worked. They were able to teach the faith. But now it seems we need something more organized. We're not interested in writing a biography of Jesus. That wasn't what the gospel writers were intending to do. They wanted to write a story of faith. So these gospels, certainly Mark and all the others, but these gospels really give us the story behind what people believed. Some of it is factual in terms of history. These are real places, these were real people, these were real events. But a good bit of it is not interested in being factual. A good bit of it is theological. It's the reflection that you get from people who are already committed in faith to a certain perspective, and they want to tell you that vision that they have through that certain perspective. That's what the gospel is all about. So there are a couple of things that are going on here to keep in mind. One is Mark needs to be able to encourage his people. He knows they're frightened and so forth, but so he needs to be able to encourage them. And he also has to be able to deal with their suffering, because he knows that's not going to stop. But he wants to encourage them to stay with the church, and he wants to talk about how suffering can be understood in a more positive way. One of the issues in all of this, of course, has been the followers of Jesus, these disciples. And as Mark is going to tell the story, one of the things he feels the church needs is he feels we need a strong model for discipleship. I need to be able to encourage my audience, Mark is saying, I need to encourage them by showing them what a real disciple is like. Now, here's what's going to happen that's going to be kind of interesting, and no other gospel does it this way. Mark is going to teach you and me, if we read this gospel, he's going to teach us about discipleship. But here's the way he's going to do it. And this is kind of baffling to some people if they're not aware of what's going on. First, he's going to teach us how not to be a disciple. And the way he's going to do that is he's going to show us a portrait of disciples who fail. The ones Jesus picks. And almost from the beginning, not quite from the beginning, but the beginning is their best time. Then shortly after that, these disciples in the Gospel of Mark never seem to catch on to who Jesus is. They seem to have their mind and heart set on power and prestige and glory and fame. They love it when Jesus does a miracle because that's a manifestation of power. They don't like it when he's starting to talk about service and suffering. They don't want anything to do with that. So you begin to notice that the disciples and Jesus start to have a tension. Jesus is trying to show them, teach them who he really is in terms of the Son of God. But they're not interested in that. They want to know about the power and the glory and the prestige. And so Jesus goes in one direction and the disciples start to go in another. Now, that is not historical, meaning Mark is not telling us factually these disciples were really dumb. The story has them being really dumb, but it's a story, theological story. He's doing this for a purpose. So, if the disciples that we find in the story are really not the way disciples are supposed to be, who's supposed to show us the way? And here's the intriguing thing about Mark's gospel. The person to look for in terms of your model for discipleship is none other than Jesus himself. He's the one you have to follow. Now remember, if Mark wants us to be able to follow Jesus in discipleship, he better show us a Jesus that we can follow. He cannot show us a Jesus so far beyond us, so far beyond our comprehension, that it makes no sense. We can never reach that far. He's so ethereal. He's so perfect that we can't match up. So Mark avoids that. That's why Mark emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, because that's something we can relate to. And so Mark is not afraid to show us a Jesus who has emotions. He'll get angry. He'll get depressed. He'll get astonished. He'll have all the emotions that we have. Now, if you read Matthew and you read Luke, you'll discover they don't like that. Any opportunity they get to downplay the humanity of Jesus, certainly if it has any emotional aspect to it, they tend to try to do that. But not Mark. Mark wants you to come to terms with that, because that's part of who Jesus is, and that's how we get to understand his real identity. So Jesus himself is the model. The tension will continue on. That tension will continue all the way through the gospel, and eventually the disciples will just leave. In chapter 14, verse 50, when Jesus comes out of the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's had this very, very traumatic experience of praying about his future and coming to terms with the fact that he's going to be crucified, and he comes out of that garden, he gets arrested. And as soon as he gets arrested, all the disciples flee, and they never come back. They're not there for the end of the story. They don't see Jesus get crucified. They don't know where he's buried. They don't know anything. The only thing we will get to see after this is Peter. And it will be Peter as he is 3 times denying Jesus. So this discipleship ends nowhere. Jesus, on the other hand, will have to go to his death alone. But the model now, the model that Mark wants us to look at in terms of who he is sort of portraying Jesus as, is this model you find in the Old Testament called the suffering servant. You find this in the book of Isaiah, second part of that book, starting with chapter 40 and going through chapter 55. But in that chapter, in that section of Isaiah, there are 4 suffering servant songs, hymns. We don't know exactly how they got there. They seem to have artificially been placed. But the Christians loved those 4 hymns because it gave them a language to understand and talk about Jesus, especially Jesus as a suffering Messiah. Judaism did not have a doctrine of suffering messiahs, not at all. But so this was a language. Especially they liked the 4th suffering servant song, starting in Isaiah chapter 52. Because as soon as Jesus emerges from the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark puts him, in terms of how he's portrayed, puts him in the role of the suffering servant. So if you want to see this, go back to the book of Isaiah and start reading chapter 52 and read all the way through chapter 53. And then you go and you read the Gospel of Mark toward the end, and you begin to see that's who Jesus really is. He's that suffering servant. And that suffering servant is one who does not defend himself, who is the lamb led to the slaughter, all of those kinds of things. So that becomes very, very significant for Mark. So keep that. That's a big portion of the Gospel of Mark. The tension between the disciples and the tension between Jesus. For our perspective, remember, we're not supposed to follow these disciples. But the tendency is we will, because we, like them, are attracted to the same things. We love power, glory, fame, fortune, all of that. We're not very much interested in service, suffering, and all the things that Jesus, has told us. So that dynamic is very, very important when you read the Gospel of Mark, not to mistake what that's about. It's not a historical thing, so we're not saying the disciples were really dumb factually, because they really weren't. But the way Mark is portraying, and keep in mind why he's doing this, so that we will know who to follow, Jesus. And the reason Mark emphasizes the humanity of Jesus so much is so we can follow him. We can follow the human Jesus. If it's a Jesus like you find in the Gospel of John, who is totally transcendent all the time, that's very hard for us to follow. We're not very transcendent anytime. And so that doesn't work much for us. But Mark has this interesting dynamic going that really does make sense. Here's another thing to pay attention to as we read the Gospel of Mark. As you go along, now the outline to the Gospel is pretty simple. You have a little introduction, it's one sentence in Mark. The introduction to the Gospel simply says, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the only introduction you have. Matthew, his introduction is the stories about the birth of Jesus. St. John's introduction to his Gospel is a long hymn, a prologue, a hymn to the Word, to the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All of that. Mark just has that one sentence, but it says everything. That one sentence, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that is a profession of faith. It contains everything of who Jesus really is, the Son of God, the good news, all of that sort of thing. Now, one of the things to start keeping in mind as you read the Gospel, and it's kind of subtle, but if you're aware of it, you can catch on. Notice how much Mark will tell you about what's going on in the story. He will show you and tell you things that nobody in the story knows. You know, when you're reading Mark, you know far more about what's going on in this story than does anybody else. Now, the question that has to be asked here, why does he do that? From the very beginning, notice, he tells you exactly who Jesus really is. That's his opening line. The good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Well, who hears that? Nobody in the story. You're the only one who hears that. He's telling that to the reader. I want you to know the full story. Here's who he really is. Now, when you read the story, you'll find that the disciples can't come to that conclusion. It's going to be forever before they ever get to understand that. You've been told from the opening line. And in case that didn't work, notice as you move down the story, the next big event, the baptism of Jesus. And toward the end of that story, where Jesus comes out of the water, you hear this voice coming out of the sky. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Who's that meant for? Who hears that? You do. That's just a reaffirmation of what you heard in the opening line. And if you still can't catch it, you read on till you get to the transfiguration story. And that's like Mark saying, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop this movie. I'm just going to tell you how it ends. I'm going to show you how it ends better. So we stop the story. We switch gears, and all of a sudden there's Jesus, Elijah, Moses, two of the very important Old Testament people. Moses, the law, Elijah, prophets, the law and the prophets, the fullness of revelation. Jesus standing right there in the middle is transfigured, becoming whiter than any fuller's material can do. Who is he? Well, he's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And so you've been able to see that. Notice he takes with him Peter, James, and John, and they see the same things you see. But they don't see them. They don't understand. Peter is beside himself. He thinks, well, maybe this is the Feast of Booths or something like that, where we commemorated the journey in the desert and where we commemorated Moses getting the law on Mount Sinai. And we used to, in our rituals, we'd build little huts outside and live in them for a few days. Maybe that's what this is. So I'll build us some huts. No, we don't need any huts. This is not about that. And he doesn't know what to think. And then finally, it's just all over. And everybody's just back to normal. What was that for? For us again. For us again. And he'll keep doing this. As he goes through the story, he will keep telling you and me more and more about what's happening, but he won't tell those people inside. Now, you have to know that because oftentimes we will miss that. We won't understand why he's saying and what he's saying, and so we will think everybody knows the same thing. We will think everybody inside the story knows what we know, and so we can't imagine. Well, how could you make that mistake? How could you not understand who fed the 5,000, how they did that? How could you not understand this and that and the other thing? Well, they don't. But he's telling us. Now, really, what he's doing is he's setting us up. And this is part of the clever theology you have in this gospel. When we get to the end of the story, there's going to be a real interesting, dramatic change take place. And then you'll know, as you think back, that's why he's been doing that. That's why he's been telling me who Jesus really is, what he's really about, who he isn't. And the people in the story can't understand that, but I do. And then you'll begin at the end, you'll figure out, or you'll be told, what that's all about. We're going to spend some time as we go through this material on a couple of major themes that you find interspersed throughout. One of the things to keep in mind, and it's one of the things that Mark is interested in, it's the understanding of suffering. Now, when you think about Jesus and suffering, most of the time, and rightly so, we think about what happened to Jesus on the cross. We think about what happened to Jesus right after he comes out of that Garden of Gethsemane. He gets arrested. He has to go through a couple of mock trials, I guess. And they convict him. He gets flogged. And then he gets crucified, which was a horrendous form of capital punishment reserved only for runaway slaves and insurrectionists. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. It was considered to be too terrible of a punishment. So a Roman citizen, you'd be stoned maybe. That would be more respectable, but no, you wouldn't be crucified. And they crucified people in fields. And they like to put it right outside the main doors of Jerusalem so that when you came to work and went home from work, you got to see all that. And it was a good warning. Are you thinking about being an insurrectionist? Well, here, look at this. Here are some. Are you thinking about running away if you're a slave? Well, here's some runaway slaves. You might want to take a look at them. It apparently was a pretty good deterrent from that way. But we try to think of, that's where we focus when we focus on the suffering of Jesus. But Mark starts Jesus' suffering way early. Jesus is suffering long before he gets to the cross. In a sense, the cross is sort of the culmination of the kinds of suffering that Jesus has had to undergo. But it wasn't reserved just for the end there. It wasn't that Jesus really didn't have to suffer much until he got arrested and until they flogged him and then they crucified him. And he was on the cross for a few hours, far less than many other people. Archaeologists say they've got evidence people could hang on the cross for 5 days. And that was a very slow form of suffocation, a horrendous form of suffocation. And while we don't want to say that Jesus didn't suffer from that, because he certainly did, but other people suffered more than he did when it comes to that. And Mark knows that. So Mark very cleverly, if you pay attention, he puts the suffering back way early, and he gives it in the form of rejection. One of the major ways that Jesus suffers is that as he goes through his life, he experiences a series of rejections by people and groups that he should be able to rely on. For example, in chapter 3, we'll see, his family thinks he's crazy. Chapter 6, he goes home for the first time to his hometown of Nazareth. They think he's a fraud. It's so bad there that he can do no miracles because their hardness of heart. And it ends up Jesus saying, he's flabbergasted at how narrow and hard these people have become. So he's rejected by his family. They think he's crazy. He's rejected by his hometown. They think he's a fraud. Chapter 14, verse 50, right after the Garden of Gethsemane scene, he gets arrested. All his disciples reject him, leave him. That's a third major rejection. So you've got family, hometown, hand-picked disciples. Mind you, these disciples are not just walk-ons. These are the people that Jesus picked. And they don't catch it. So he's rejected by his disciples. And the kicker comes, and most people don't like this one at all, in chapter 15, verse 33. He's hanging on the cross. And the last words he says are, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's a quote. It's a quote from Psalm 22. It's a long psalm, and it's technically a lament. If you study how laments work, quite often you'll discover at first you will get the lamenting, how bad things are, and then as the psalm progresses, it starts to change mood. And by the end of the psalm, the person who's reciting this or who's saying all of this decides that things are really pretty good after all. Many people think that's what Jesus wants to do, that he's just giving you the opening line, but he really wants you to think that things are really pretty good. And so rather than recite the whole psalm, he just recites the opening line. That doesn't make any sense. If he wanted to recite the happy part, he could have gone to the end of the psalm and recited it. He is feeling that he has been rejected even by God. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now we know factually he has not. But in his human mode, Jesus is responding here as a human. And he feels, humanly speaking, like the whole thing hasn't worked. And the last thing to rely on God, he cannot rely on. Now we know as soon as he dies, the curtain of the temple's torn in two, and he has been accepted. He has not been rejected. But he doesn't know that, humanly speaking. And Mark won't let up. Mark won't let up. So why Mark wants to do this is because he wants to give us something to hang on to. Who among us has not known the real pain and suffering that comes with rejection? And not only that, but Mark wants to get it even further and said, this is not just rejection by anybody, but when you get rejected by those people or those groups to whom you feel strongly you should have a commitment from. They should support you. They should understand you. And they don't. And they don't. Who has not been through that? A spouse, a friend, a sibling, somebody. Things, people that, I thought you understood me. I thought you knew how they, of all people, you should. And they don't. And then we don't know where to turn. That's the suffering that Mark wants us to talk about. That's the suffering that's going to be amalgamated and come out symbolically on the cross. The cross is the ultimate rejection. When we are asked spiritually, to amalgamate ourselves with the suffering of Jesus, that doesn't mean you try to crawl back on the cross with him. You can't do that. But you certainly can review the kinds of suffering that he had to undergo. And in many, many cases, we can say, I know what you're talking about because I have been there. This is all part of this salvation story that we are being told. Right in the middle of this gospel, there is an interesting theme developed in chapters 8, 9, and 10. There's 16 chapters in Mark, and so 8, 9, and 10 about right in the center, physically. It's going to be right here in the center of this gospel that one of the most important themes in the Gospel of Mark is going to come and be emerged. And that's going to be his theme of discipleship. It's going to start in chapter 8, verse 27, where Jesus is with his disciples, you remember, and he says, what are the folks saying about me? What's the press saying? Who am I? What do they say? Well, John the Baptist, Elijah, maybe, some say one of the prophets, all that. But then he pinpoints, who do you say I am? Peter comes right out. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Well, that's the beginning. Now you're going to find there's some interesting things we'll talk about later that go on there. But this begins a 3-chapter expose of what discipleship is all about. It's going to be structured around 3 times Jesus will predict his passion, his suffering, death, and resurrection. In all 3 cases, he'll do it once in chapter 8, once in 9, and once in 8, 9, and 10. Then, when he does that, you're going to find that he'll be misunderstood. So that'll be the second thing. First thing is, he tells you, I'm going to suffer, die, and be buried, and be raised up on the 3rd day. The response to that, number 2, will be rejection by, they won't believe it, the disciples. He and Peter are going to get into a knockdown, drag out. They won't do that. The third element is, and Jesus comes back, and he gives them what is called a corrective teaching. It's in that 3rd section, that corrective teaching part, that Jesus, or that Mark develops his theology of discipleship. So we're going to spend some time looking at those 3 chapters because they're going to be very important. At the end of that segment then, that'll be the final time Jesus will teach his disciples anything privately. As soon as we get into chapter 11, we're going to get Jesus going from Galilee down to Jerusalem. He's going to enter Jerusalem, and then we're going to be into the Passion narrative, which is very, very significant. The Passion narrative of the Gospel of Mark, kind of really chapters 14, 15, and 16, but it starts almost as early as 11, is the oldest written section of the Gospel that we have. And that Passion narrative, according to Mark, became the model, certainly for Matthew and for Luke. And so that Passion narrative becomes very, very significant. It was probably the first segment of the gospel that was put into writing. And the reason for that is because it contained the most important faith elements in the gospel: Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. But here again, as quite often happens, Mark will give it a certain twist. And it'll be also at this time, toward the end of this narrative, that we will discover why we have been given so much information in the past that we didn't know exactly what to do with. Well, he'll tell you when we get to the end of that. So that's sort of an overview of some of the things we're going to do. The next conference is going to be focused on the Galilean ministry. And so we'll go back now and we'll look at how this whole thing begins, but we'll look a little more carefully at some of the details that we find there. And so we're going to look at that. We'll look at those rejection stories a little more carefully. Then we're going to go after that, we're going to be looking carefully at this theology of discipleship section. And then we're going to be looking a little bit more at this passion narrative as it comes about. We can't do everything in detail, but we'll get enough so that you should be able to have a pretty clear understanding of this gospel. The recommendation I always make, and I'm going to make it again, is if you have not ever read this gospel from beginning to end like a story, this would be the time to do that. It's a really good thing to do. It's not hard to read. It's only 16 little chapters. And read it and look at the characters and look at the plot. See the context of how things unfold. Most of the time we only read little segments of the gospel. and we don't get any of the context. We don't get any of the environment around it. So this is going to be a good time to read it simply as a story. Watch it unfold, and when you do that, then the stuff that we talk about in these conferences will make more sense to you. So, Gospel of Mark, and we'll continue on with the segment next about the Galilean ministry. What does he do? The responses that he gets, and what we are to make of all that. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.